I was standing in the cereal aisle of Whole Foods when my marriage of 50 years ended. 6 words on a glowing screen. I can't do this anymore. Sorry. That's it. No phone call. No face-to-face conversation. Just a text message that appeared between a notification about my granddaughter's soccer game and a reminder to pick up my blood pressure medication. 50 years, and it ended the same way my grandson cancels plans with his friends. I remember staring at those words, reading them over and over, as if repetition would somehow change their meaning. The phone felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in my hand. Around me, people continued shopping, reaching for boxes of Cheerios and organic granola, completely unaware that my entire world had just collapsed in the time it takes to microwave a cup of coffee. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab the nearest stranger and say, "Do you see this? Do you see what just happened?" But I didn't, because that's not what 72-year-old women do in public. We hold it together. We've been holding it together our entire lives. My hand started shaking, not the gentle tremor that comes with age, but a violent, uncontrollable shake that made me drop my phone. It clattered against the tile floor, and when I bent down to pick it up, I saw it. The screen had cracked. A single fracture line ran right through Robert's message, splitting it in two. I can't help but think now that it was perfect, poetic even. Our marriage, cracked and split, displayed on a broken screen for anyone to see. I don't remember driving home. I know I must have checked out, must have loaded groceries into my car, and must have navigated the 15-minute drive from the store to our house on Maple Street, but I have no memory of it. It's like my brain just shut down and went into some kind of autopilot mode to protect me from the full weight of what was happening. The next thing I remember clearly is pulling into our driveway, seeing Robert's Subaru wasn't there, and feeling this strange mixture of relief and terror. Relief that I wouldn't have to face him yet. Terror because his absence confirmed that this was real. The house was exactly as I'd left it an hour earlier. Coffee cups in the sink from breakfast. The morning newspaper was folded on the kitchen table, the crossword puzzle half finished. Robert's reading glasses perched on top of the paper where he always left them. Everything looked so normal, so mundane, so perfectly ordinary. How could everything look the same when nothing would ever be the same again? I walked through our home like a ghost, touching things, looking at things as if seeing them for the first time. The grandfather clock in the hallway that we'd bought at an estate sale 30 years ago. The sofa we'd argued about because I wanted navy and he wanted gray, and we'd compromised on that awful blue-gray color that neither of us really liked, but we'd kept anyway because that's what marriage was, right? Compromise. The wedding photo on the mantle, me in white, him in that terrible brown tuxedo that was fashionable in 1975, both of us so young, so impossibly young, grinning like we had it all figured out. I had to sit down. My legs just gave out, and I found myself on the edge of our bed, the bed we'd shared for half a century, and that's when I noticed it. His closet door was open. Not just open, but empty. Well, not completely empty, but half empty. His everyday clothes were gone. His favorite sweaters. His worn-out jeans that I'd been begging him to replace for years. His side of the closet looked like a mouth with missing teeth, gaps where his life used to hang. He'd planned this. That's what hit me hardest in that moment. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. He hadn't sent that text in a moment of anger or frustration. He'd packed. He'd chosen which clothes to take and which to leave behind. He'd made lists in his head, things I'll need, things I can leave. And he'd done all of this while I was out buying groceries, while I was debating between almond milk and oat milk, completely oblivious to the fact that my husband was packing up 50 years of his life like he was checking out of a hotel. I found the note on the kitchen counter. I'd walked past it twice before I saw it, probably because my brain was actively trying to protect me from more pain. It was written on the notepad we kept by the phone, the one where we left each other messages about doctor's appointments and whose turn it was to take out the trash. Margaret, it started. Not Dear Margaret or My Love or any of the endearments he'd used over the years. Just Margaret. Like I was someone he barely knew. The note was practical, clinical even. He'd moved his things to a temporary place. His lawyer would be in touch. He was sorry it had come to this. We'd talk soon. He hoped we could handle this maturely. Maturely. I read that word and laughed, actually laughed, a sound that came out harsh and bitter and nothing like my normal laugh. He wanted me to handle maturely the fact that he'd just blown up our entire life via text message while I was shopping for cereal. I did what any modern woman does in a crisis. I called my daughter. Jessica lives in Portland, a 3-hour flight away, and I knew it was the middle of her workday, but I called anyway. She didn't answer. I tried my son, Michael, straight to voicemail. Both my children, busy with their lives, their jobs, and their own families, were completely unreachable in my moment of crisis. I was surrounded by technology that promised connection, sitting in a house with 3 phones, 2 tablets, and a laptop, and I'd never felt more alone in my life. So I did the only thing I could think of. I texted Jessica, "Call me when you can. It's about Dad." 3 minutes later, my phone rang. That's the world we live in now, isn't it? A text gets an immediate response. A phone call goes ignored. I told her. I heard her gasp and heard her say, "What? What do you mean?" like I'd spoken in a foreign language. I read her the text. All 6 words. There was a long silence on the other end, and then she said something I'll never forget. "Mom, that can't be real. Dad wouldn't do that. Not in a text. You must have misunderstood." But I hadn't misunderstood. The text was clear. The empty closet was clear. The note was clear. And yet my daughter's first instinct was to assume I'd gotten it wrong, that I'd misread the situation, that surely her father wouldn't communicate something this important, this devastating, through a text message. Because it was incomprehensible. We all knew Robert. Steady, reliable, old-fashioned Robert, who still wrote thank you notes by hand and called people on their birthdays. This wasn't him. Except it was. Over the next hour, my phone exploded with activity. Jessica called Michael. Michael called me. They created a group chat, them and me, trying to figure out what was happening. The texts flew back and forth. "Did you guys fight?" "No." "Is there someone else?" "I don't know." "Where did he go?" "I don't know." "What did you do?" "Nothing." "I did nothing." That was the truth, wasn't it? I'd done nothing. We'd both done nothing for years. We'd been living in this comfortable, quiet nothing. And apparently, Robert had decided he wanted something. Then Jessica asked a question that changed everything. "Mom, have you noticed Dad acting strange lately?" And that's when the pieces started falling into place. The past 6 months, maybe longer, played back in my mind like a movie I'd been watching without really seeing. Robert is on his phone constantly, something he never used to do. Robert had been a late adopter of technology and had resisted getting a smartphone until 3 years ago when Michael insisted he needed one for safety reasons. But lately, he'd been glued to it, scrolling, typing, and sometimes even smiling at the screen. I'd asked him about it once, casually, trying not to sound like a suspicious wife. "What are you always looking at on there?" He'd shrugged, not looking up. "Just a support group I found online. For retirees. People adjusting to not working." It had sounded reasonable. Robert had retired from his job as a civil engineer 2 years ago, and he'd struggled with it. We both had. 40 years of alarm clocks and schedules and purpose, and then suddenly, nothing. Just endless days stretching out before us with no structure, no obligations, and no reason to get dressed some mornings. I'd been relieved, actually, that he'd found something that engaged him. I joined a book club myself and started taking yoga classes, trying to figure out who I was outside of being a mother and an executive assistant and a wife. We'd been doing our separate things, giving each other space, proud of how well we were handling retirement. Except we weren't handling it at all. We were just drifting further apart while convincing ourselves we were being mature and independent. The phone rang again. This time, I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway because what else did I have to lose? It was Karen, a friend from our couples book club. "Margaret, honey, I just heard. I'm so sorry. If you need anything at all." I hadn't told Karen. I'd told no one except my children. "How did you?" I started to ask, but she interrupted me. "Linda saw Robert loading boxes into his car this morning. She called me. We've been so worried." And there it was. The small-town reality of modern life. Someone sees something, tells someone, who tells someone else, and suddenly your private tragedy is public knowledge. Linda, our neighbor 3 houses down, had watched my husband pack up his life and leave, and instead of coming to check on me, she called Karen to gossip about it. I felt exposed and humiliated, like I was standing naked in front of the entire neighborhood. Karen kept talking, her voice careful and gentle, like she was speaking to a child. We all thought you two were so solid. You just seemed so, I don't know, comfortable together. At the last book club, you were planning that anniversary trip to Italy. 50 years. God, Margaret, 50 years. How does someone what did he do? Just leave. How indeed? That was the question I couldn't answer. How does someone share 50 years of life, 50 years of breakfasts and arguments and holidays and grandchildren and hospital waiting rooms and mortgage payments and inside jokes that no one else understands, and then just walk away? But even as I wondered, I knew. Because in Karen's words, I heard the truth I'd been avoiding. You seem so comfortable together. Comfortable. What a terrible word to describe a marriage. We've been comfortable like old shoes are comfortable. Familiar. Worn in. Reliable. But not exciting. Not passionate. Not really connected anymore. Somewhere along the way, we'd stopped being Robert and Margaret, two people who loved each other, and become what? Roommates with a shared history. Co-managers of a life we'd built together but no longer really inhabited. After I got off the phone with Karen, after I promised I was fine and yes, I'd call if I needed anything, I did something I'd never done before. I went through Robert's things. Not like a detective in a movie, I didn't steam open letters or hack into his computer. I just looked, really looked, at the life he'd left behind, trying to find clues about why. His nightstand drawer still had the book he'd been reading, a thriller about a retired detective who solves one last case. Bookmark on page 47, right where he'd left it 3 weeks ago. He'd never finished it. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen him finish a book. His workshop in the garage was full of projects he'd started and abandoned. A birdhouse half-painted. A broken chair he'd meant to fix. Everywhere I looked, I saw evidence of men who'd stopped finishing things, who'd started checking out of his life long before he sent that text. And then I found his iPad. He'd left it behind, probably because he'd been in such a hurry or maybe because he had a newer one. I knew his password. It was our wedding anniversary, and that detail broke my heart more than anything else that day. He still used our wedding date as his password even as he was leaving our marriage. I opened it, and there it was. The support group he'd mentioned. Silver Years Support Network. A forum for retirees dealing with identity issues, loss of purpose, and reinventing themselves in their 70s. I scrolled through his posts, months of them, and I felt like I was reading about a stranger. He'd written about feeling invisible, about how he'd spent 40 years being someone important, someone people came to with problems, someone who built things that mattered, and now he was just an old man taking up space. He wrote about watching me go to my yoga class and book club and feeling left behind. He wrote about how we used to talk about everything, and now we just talked about whether we needed milk and who was picking up the grandkids next weekend. And then I saw her name, Diane. She'd responded to one of his posts with understanding and empathy and questions about what he really wanted out of this next phase of life. I clicked on her profile. 68. Divorced. Living in the same city as us. I scrolled through their exchanges, months of conversations that had clearly moved from the public forum to private messages based on the references to things they'd discussed offline. I felt sick. But more than that, I felt something unexpected. I felt angry at myself. Because reading his words, seeing his pain laid out in digital text, I realized I'd known. Maybe not consciously, but somewhere deep down, I'd known he was struggling, and I'd chosen not to see it because it was easier not to. The sun was setting by the time I closed the iPad. I'd spend hours reading through Robert's secret life, this whole world he'd built while living in the same house as me. The irony wasn't lost on me. Technology, this thing that was supposed to bring people together, had been the tool he used to leave me. And now it was the tool I was using to understand why. My phone buzzed again. Another text. This time from Michael. Mom, I've been thinking. You need to talk to Dad face to face. This text thing is bullshit. He owes you a real conversation. He was right, of course. But the thought of seeing Robert, of sitting across from him and asking him why our 50 years together weren't enough, filled me with a dread so deep I could taste it. What if the answer was worse than not knowing? What if he looked me in the eye and said the words no one wants to hear, that he just didn't love me anymore, that I wasn't enough, that I never had been? But as I sat there in our darkening living room, surrounded by 5 decades of accumulated life, our furniture, and photos and memories, I realized something. I had a choice to make. I could let this text message define the end of my story, let these 6 words be the final chapter of Margaret and Robert. Or I could do something I hadn't done in years. I could fight. Not fight to get him back. Maybe that ship had already sailed. But fight for a real ending. Fight for a conversation that honored what we'd been to each other. Fight for the dignity of a proper goodbye instead of this coward's exit through a text message. The question was, did I have the courage to face whatever truth was waiting on the other side of that conversation? After 50 years of marriage, did I really know my husband at all? And more terrifyingly, did I really know myself? I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Instead, I did something I swore I'd never do. At 2 in the morning, I created a fake profile on that support forum where Robert had met her. I know what you're thinking. That's crazy behavior. That's the kind of thing desperate women do in movies, and you're right. But desperate is exactly what I was. I needed to understand what had been so compelling about these strangers online that my husband had chosen them over me. I needed to see what he saw. I called myself Sarah. Posted a simple introduction about being a newly retired teacher struggling with purpose. Within 20 minutes, I had 3 responses. Within an hour, I understood everything. These people were kind. They asked real questions. They wanted to know not just what I did, but who I was. When was the last time Robert and I had asked each other real questions? When was the last time either of us had been curious about the other's inner life? I couldn't remember. That's the terrifying truth. I genuinely could not remember the last time my husband and I had a conversation that went deeper than grocery lists and medication schedules. I saw Diane's profile then, her real one, not just the sanitized version I'd found on Robert's iPad. She was pretty in that effortless way some women are in their 60s, with silver hair worn long and photos of her hiking at art galleries and holding a glass of wine at sunset. Her profile said she'd been divorced for 5 years and had reinvented herself as a life coach for people in transition. Of course she had. Of course Robert had found someone who made a living helping people figure out who they were. I'd spent 50 years being what everyone needed me to be, and I'd forgotten to ask myself who I actually was underneath all those roles. The sun came up, and I was still at the computer, still reading through posts from people I'd never met, people pouring out their fears and dreams to strangers because the people they lived with had stopped listening years ago. I heard the words in my head that I didn't want to hear. You stopped listening to? Margaret. When was the last time you asked Robert about his dreams? When was the last time you told him yours? But I pushed those thoughts away because they required me to take responsibility, and I wasn't ready for that yet. It was easier to be the victim. It's easier to be the wronged wife. It's easier to make this entirely his fault. My phone rang at 7:30. Robert. His name on my screen made my heart lurch in a way it hadn't in years. Isn't that strange? 50 years of marriage, and seeing his name suddenly felt dangerous again, exciting in this terrible way. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, trying to sound calmer than I felt. Margaret, he said, and his voice sounded tired, older than I remembered. We need to talk. I wanted to scream at him. You think we need to talk? You ended 50 years with a text message, and now you want to talk? But what I said was, yes, we do. We agreed to meet at Morrison's coffee shop, neutral territory, public enough that neither of us could make a scene. He suggested next day. I said no. If we were going to do this, we were doing it now. Today. I wasn't going to give him time to rehearse his explanations or for me to lose my nerve. He hesitated, then agreed. 10 o'clock. 2 hours away. 2 hours to shower, to dress, and to decide who I was going to be when I faced him. The wronged wife, the dignified woman, the shattered heart. In the end, I chose armor. I wore the blue dress he'd always said brought out my eyes, put on makeup for the first time in weeks, and did my hair. If he was going to destroy me, I was going to look put together while it happened. But here's what I didn't expect. When I walked into Morrison's and saw him sitting in a corner booth, he looked terrible. Robert, who'd always been meticulous about his appearance, looked like he hadn't slept either. His hair was uncombed, his shirt wrinkled, and when he saw me, something flickered across his face that might have been pain. Good, I thought. Good. You should hurt. But there was something else there too, something I couldn't quite name. Relief maybe? Or was it fear? I sat down across from him, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. What do you say to someone you've known for 50 years and suddenly don't know at all? The waitress came, an older woman named Betty who'd been serving us coffee at Morrison's for years. She looked between us with knowing eyes, poured our coffees without asking, and left quickly. Even strangers could feel the tension radiating from our table. Robert added cream and 2 sugars to his coffee, exactly as he'd done for 5 decades, and that mundane gesture made me want to cry. How could everything be different and nothing be different all at once? I'm sorry, he started, but I cut him off. A text message, Robert, 50 years, and you couldn't tell me to my face. He flinched like I'd slapped him, and I felt a savage satisfaction in causing him pain. But then he said something that knocked the wind out of me. I tried, Margaret. I tried for 6 months. But every time I started to say something, you'd ask me to pick up the dry cleaning or tell me about your book club or show me pictures of the grandkids, and the moment would pass. So I kept putting it off. And then I realized I was waiting for the perfect time to destroy your life. And there is no perfect time for that. Was he serious? He was making this my fault because I talked about normal life, because I didn't psychically intuit that he was miserable. So instead, you sent a text while I was shopping for cereal. My voice was rising, and Betty glanced over from behind the counter. I lowered it. You packed your things and ran away like a coward. He nodded slowly, not defending himself, and somehow that made me angrier. Yes, he said simply. I did. Because I'm a coward, Margaret. I've been a coward for years. That's what I'm trying to tell you. The words started pouring out of him then, faster and faster, like he'd been holding them back for so long they'd build up pressure. He talked about retirement, about waking up every day with nothing to do and nowhere to be, about watching me adapt, make friends, and join clubs while he floundered, about feeling invisible in our own home, about how we'd have entire days where our only conversations were logistics and neither of us seemed to notice or care. When did we stop being Robert and Margaret? He asked, his voice cracking. When did we just become 2 people sharing space? I wanted to disagree. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that our marriage was fine, that we were fine. But the truth was sitting heavy in my chest, and for the first time in days, I let myself feel it. He wasn't wrong. We had stopped being Robert and Margaret. We'd become automatons going through the motions of a marriage, and if I was honest, truly honest, I'd felt it too. I'd felt the loneliness of lying next to someone every night and never really touching them. I'd felt the sadness of having 1,000 thoughts throughout the day and no one to share them with. I'd just been better at ignoring it, or maybe worse at admitting it. Tell me about her, I said, because I needed to know. I needed to understand what this Diane person had that I didn't. Robert looked surprised, then uncomfortable, then resigned. She listened, he said, and those 2 words cut deeper than anything else he could have said. When I talked, she actually listened. She asked questions. She wanted to know what I thought, what I felt, and what I was afraid of. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time you and I had that kind of conversation. The accusation hung in the air between us, and I felt my own anger rising to meet it. That's not fair, Robert. I listened. I always listened. But even as I said it, I was remembering the times he'd start to tell me something, and I'd interrupt with my own story. Remembering the times he'd look like he wanted to talk, and I'd turn on the television. Remembering the slow, gradual way we'd stopped really seeing each other, until we were just going through the scripts of what a married couple does without any of the actual substance. When did you last ask me what I was afraid of? He said quietly, and I had no answer. I couldn't remember. When did you last tell me about a dream you had, not for the grandkids or for our retirement, but for yourself? Again, silence. The terrible truth was that we'd both stopped sharing our real selves years ago. We'd become excellent at co-managing a household and a family, but we'd forgotten how to be intimate. Not sexually, though that had faded too, but emotionally. We'd forgotten how to be vulnerable with each other. Is it serious? With her? I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. Robert looked down at his coffee. I don't know. Maybe. She makes me feel like I matter. Like what I think and feel is important. Like I'm not just someone's father or grandfather or the guy who used to be an engineer. She sees me. And there it was. The thing I couldn't argue with. Because I didn't see him anymore either. When was the last time I'd really looked at my husband? Really seen him as a whole person with needs and fears and dreams? I'd been so busy maintaining the facade of our perfect 50-year marriage that I'd forgotten there was supposed to be an actual relationship underneath it all. We sat there for another hour, and we talked more honestly than we had in years. He told me about the loneliness of retirement, how he'd wake up in the morning with nowhere to go and no one who needed him and feel like he was drowning. I told him about my own struggles, about feeling like I'd lost myself somewhere between being a mother and a wife and a career woman, and now I didn't know who Margaret was outside of those roles. We talked about the grandkids and how watching our children build their own lives made us feel obsolete. We talked about getting older and facing mortality and realizing that we had maybe 20 good years left. And did we want to spend them being lonely together? But here's the thing about honest conversations that come too late. They're both healing and devastating. Because every truth we shared made me realize how much we'd lost, how many years we'd wasted being too afraid or too proud or too comfortable to admit we were struggling. We could try, I heard myself say. We could go to counseling. We could learn to really talk to each other again. Robert looked at me with something like sorrow in his eyes. Could we, though? Or would we just go back to our old patterns after a few weeks? I've thought about this, Margaret, 4 months. And I think maybe we've gone too far. Maybe some things, once broken, can't be fixed. Those words should have devastated me. But instead, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Because he was right. We could drag this out, go to counseling, make promises we'd struggle to keep, and end up right back here in 6 months or a year. Or we could be honest about what we'd become. 2 people who'd loved each other once, maybe still loved each other in some way, but who'd grown into different people who wanted different things. 2 people who'd spent so long being what the other needed that they'd forgotten how to be themselves. When did you become so wise? I asked, and he laughed, a sound I hadn't heard in months. I'm not wise. If I were wise, I wouldn't have sent you a text message from the grocery store. We both smiled then, and for a moment, we were us again. Just Robert and Margaret, 2 people who knew each other better than anyone else in the world, even if we'd forgotten to use that knowledge. I really am sorry, he said. About the text. About all of it. You deserve better. And I found myself saying, we both did. We decided to separate officially. To tell the kids together, as a united front. To split our assets fairly without lawyers if we could manage it. To try to preserve some dignity in the ending of what we'd built together. It felt surreal, sitting in Morrison's coffee shop planning the dissolution of 50 years like we were planning a vacation. But it also felt right in a way I couldn't explain. Like we were finally being honest with each other, finally treating each other like adults instead of like children who needed to be protected from hard truths. When I left Morrison's that morning, I felt hollowed out but oddly light. I'd gone in expecting a fight, expecting drama, expecting him to be the villain in my story. Instead, I'd found 2 people who'd slowly stopped fighting for their relationship and were now paying the price. Neither of us was the villain. We were just human, flawed, scared, confused humans who'd done our best and come up short. But the hard part was just beginning, because now I had to face my children. Jessica and Michael flew in 3 days later, both of them taking time off work, both of them looking at Robert and me like we'd lost our minds. We sat in the living room, the 4 of us, in the same spots we'd sat in for thousands of family meetings over the years. Only this time, we weren't discussing college choices or wedding plans or where to hold Thanksgiving. We were discussing the end of their parents' marriage. Michael was angry. Of course he was. He's always been protective, always been the one to fix things. You're giving up, he said, his voice tight with frustration. That's what this is. You're both just giving up. Jessica was crying silently, mascara running down her face, and I wanted to comfort her, but I didn't know how. How do you comfort your daughter when you're the one causing her pain? We're not giving up, Robert said quietly. We're letting go. There's a difference. But Jessica shook her head. No, there isn't. You promised each other forever. You stood up in front of everyone and made vows. 50 years, and you're just throwing it away. Her words echoed my own thoughts from a week ago, before I'd seen Robert, before we'd talked. I understood her anger, her confusion. Their entire foundation was built on us. On Robert and Margaret. On Mom and Dad, who'd been together forever, who'd weathered everything, who were proof that love could last. And we were shattering that foundation. Sometimes, I found myself saying, forever looks different than you think it will. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is let them go. Jessica looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. How can you be so calm about this? Don't you care? Don't you still love him? And there it was. The question I've been asking myself every minute since that text message. Did I still love Robert? The answer was complicated. Yes, I loved him. But I wasn't in love with him. I hadn't been for years. I loved our history, our children, and our grandchildren. I loved the man he used to be and the woman I used to be when we were together. But I didn't love who we'd become. Two strangers sharing a house, going through motions, slowly dying inside while pretending everything was fine. I do love your father, I said carefully. But love isn't always enough. Sometimes love isn't the question. Sometimes the question is, are we good for each other? Are we making each other better or worse? Are we living or just existing? Michael stood up, too agitated to sit. This is bullshit. Total bullshit. You don't throw away 50 years because you're bored. Because retirement is hard. Because you found someone more exciting. He was looking at his father when he said that last part, and Robert's face went pale. You told them. Robert asked me, and I nodded. I told him everything. About Diane, about the support group, about the months of secret conversations. I thought they deserved the truth. But looking at Michael's face now, I wondered if I'd been wrong. Some life coach. Michael spat the words out like they tasted bad. You left Mom for some life coach you met on the internet. Do you know how pathetic that is? The thing about seeing your parents as people instead of as parents is that it's uncomfortable for everyone involved. Michael wanted a villain. He wanted this to be simple. Bad dad left good mom for another woman. But life isn't that simple, and neither are relationships. Your father didn't leave me for Diane, I said, and they both looked at me in surprise. He left because we'd already left each other. We just didn't have the courage to admit it until now. We talked for hours that day. It was brutal and necessary and heartbreaking. Jessica wanted to know if we'd tried counseling. Yes, we had, twice over the years. Once when the kids were teenagers and we were drowning in stress. Once 5 years ago when we'd hit a rough patch. It had helped temporarily, but we'd always slip back into our old patterns. Michael wanted to know if this was final. Could we change our minds? Robert and I looked at each other, and something passed between us. No, we both understood. This was final. Not because we hated each other, but because we knew ourselves well enough now to know that going back would be choosing comfort over growth, and we'd already done that for too long. By the time they left, exhausted and emotionally wrung out, I felt ancient. Older than my 72 years. Old enough to have watched my children grapple with the reality that their parents were flawed, confused people who didn't have all the answers. Old enough to have disappointed them in the worst way possible. Old enough to have to figure out who I was going to be in the next chapter of my life, assuming I had the courage to write it. The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers and paperwork and awkward encounters. Dividing up 50 years of accumulated stuff is its own special kind of torture. Who gets the wedding china we'd never used? Who gets the photo albums? Who gets the friends we'd made together? It turns out that untangling two lives that have been intertwined for half a century is far more complicated than anyone tells you. It's not just about assets and property. It's about deciding which memories you get to keep and which ones belong to both of you. And how do you split a memory anyway? I moved through those days like a ghost, functioning but not really present. I'd wake up and forget for a moment that everything had changed, reach out for Robert's warm body next to me, and find cold sheets. I'd make too much coffee and set 2 mugs on the counter before remembering I only needed one. I'd start to tell him something funny that happened and pull out my phone before realizing I had no one to text. The loneliness was physical, an ache in my chest that never quite went away. But something else was happening too. Something I didn't expect. I was starting to feel angry. Not at Robert, though that came and went in waves. At myself. At the years we'd wasted. At the woman I'd been, who'd chosen comfort over honesty, who'd avoided difficult conversations because they were uncomfortable, who'd settled for a mediocre marriage because good enough seemed better than the alternative. Who was that woman? And why had I let her run my life for so long? One night, about a month after Robert left, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone, that terrible modern habit of filling every quiet moment with digital noise. I clicked on the support forum, the one where I'd created that fake profile. I'd forgotten about Sarah, my alter ego. There were messages waiting for me. Diane had responded to one of my posts. Sarah, she'd written, "You talk about feeling lost, but maybe you're not lost. Maybe you're just becoming someone new. That's not a loss. That's transformation." I stared at those words for a long time. Diane, the woman who'd helped my husband leave me, was giving me advice about transformation. The irony was so thick I almost laughed. But the words wouldn't leave me alone. Maybe you're not lost. Maybe you're becoming someone new. Was that what this was? Not an ending but a beginning? Not a loss but a transformation? It was a nice idea, poetic even. But it required me to believe that I was capable of being someone new at 72, and I wasn't sure I believed that yet. I started therapy the next week. Not couples therapy, just me, sitting in a comfortable chair across from a woman named Dr. Sarah Chun, who was probably young enough to be my daughter and who listened to my story without judgment. "What do you want, Margaret?" she asked me in our 3rd session. "Not what you think you should want. Not what your children want. What do you want?" And I realized I had no idea. I'd spent 50 years wanting whatever kept everyone else happy. Whatever made Robert comfortable, made my children proud, and made my parents approve when they were alive. I'd never asked myself what I wanted. I didn't even know how. So Dr. Chen gave me homework. For 1 week, every time I did something, I had to ask myself, am I doing this because I want to, or because I think I should? It was harder than it sounds. I discovered that almost everything I did was a should. I should go to church on Sunday. I should call my sister. I should eat healthy meals. I should keep the house clean. I should be devastated about my divorce. I should be angry at Robert. I should be focused on getting him back. Should. My entire life was built on shoulds. But then I asked myself, what do I want? And the answer that came back surprised me. I wanted to be alone. Not lonely, but alone. I wanted to wake up in the morning and not have to think about anyone else's needs. I wanted to eat cereal for dinner if I felt like it. I wanted to leave dishes in the sink overnight. I wanted to go to bed at 8 or stay up until 3 reading. I wanted to find out who Margaret was when she wasn't being someone's wife or mother or grandmother. Was that selfish? Maybe. Did I care? Not as much as I thought I would. I started small. I stopped going to book club, the one where everyone knew about my situation and looked at me with pitying eyes. I stopped answering my phone every time it rang just because it rang. I stopped feeling guilty about disappointing people. And you know what happened? The world didn't end. My children were fine. My friends adjusted. Life went on, just different. But the real breakthrough came 6 weeks after Robert left. I was sitting in my living room, the one that felt too big now that it was just me, and my granddaughter Lily called. She's 16, smart as a whip, and she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Grandma," she said, "Mom says I shouldn't ask you this, but I'm going to anyway. Are you okay? Like, really okay?" And for the first time since this all started, I told the truth. "No," I said. "I'm not okay. I'm sad and scared and angry and confused. But I think maybe not being okay right now is exactly what I need to be." There was a pause, and then Lily said something that changed everything. "Good. Mom and Uncle Michael keep talking about you like you're broken, like you need to be fixed. But Grandpa didn't break you, Grandma. He just showed you that something wasn't working. That's not the same thing." Out of the mouths of babes, as they say. Or in this case, out of the mouths of teenagers who haven't learned yet to pretend everything's fine when it isn't. After I hung up with Lily, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to my closet and pulled out the boxes from the top shelf, the ones filled with things I'd put away because there was no room for them in my carefully constructed life. My art supplies from college, the journal I'd kept in my 20s, the travel brochures for places I'd wanted to visit but never did because Robert preferred staycations, the books on photography I'd collected but never read because there was always something more important to do. I spread it all out on my bed and looked at the remnants of dreams I'd forgotten I had. When had I stopped wanting things? When had I decided that being a good wife and mother meant giving up the parts of myself that didn't fit into those roles? I couldn't pinpoint a specific moment. It had been gradual, a slow erosion of self that I hadn't noticed until there was almost nothing left. But almost nothing isn't the same as nothing. There were still embers there. The question was, did I have the courage to fan them back into flame? That night, I sat down and made a list. Not a to-do list, but a want list. Things I wanted to do, places I wanted to go, and people I wanted to become. It started small. I want to take a pottery class. I want to learn to use my camera. I want to travel somewhere alone. But as I wrote, the wants got bigger and bolder. I want to feel passionate about something again. I want to take risks. I want to stop caring what people think. I want to discover who I am when I'm not being who everyone needs me to be. The list terrified me. Because wanting things meant being vulnerable. It meant possibly failing. It meant admitting that maybe, just maybe, this divorce wasn't the worst thing that could happen. Maybe it was the thing that had to happen for me to wake up. But was I ready to see it that way? Was I ready to stop being the victim and start being the architect of whatever came next? I looked at my phone, at the string of messages from well-meaning friends offering sympathy and support in casseroles. I looked at the empty spot on a mantle where our wedding photo used to be before I'd finally taken it down. I looked at myself in a mirror across the room, really looked, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Not the wife who'd been left. Not the mother worried about disappointing her children. Not the 72-year-old woman afraid she was too old to start over. I saw Margaret. Just Margaret. And for the first time in 50 years, I had to figure out who that was. The question that kept me up that night wasn't about Robert or Diane or whether we'd made the right choice. It wasn't even about whether I could forgive him or myself for the years we'd lost. The question was simpler and more terrifying than any of that. If I could be anyone and do anything, who would I be and what would I do? And did I have the courage to find out? Would I actually do it? Would I take my own list seriously? Or would it end up like every other promise I'd made to myself over the years, stuffed in a drawer and forgotten? That question haunted me for 3 days after I wrote it. The list sat on my kitchen table, taunting me every time I walked past. 10 wants. 10 things that terrified me. 10 possibilities for a life I couldn't quite imagine, but desperately needed to believe in. On the 4th day, I did something impulsive. I signed up for pottery class at the community center. Just clicked the button, enter my credit card information, and committed before I could talk myself out of it. The class started the following Tuesday at 6 in the evening, and I had no idea what I was doing. I'd taken one pottery class in college 50 years ago, and I'd been terrible at it. My bowls looked like ashtrays. My vases collapsed into lumps. But that was the old Margaret, the one who quit things she wasn't immediately good at because failure felt like a moral failing. Who would the new Margaret be? I guess I was about to find out. The community center smelled like wet clay and possibility when I walked in that Tuesday. There were 8 of us in the class, and I was relieved to see I wasn't the oldest. A man who introduced himself as Frank looked to be in his 80s, hands gnarled with arthritis but eyes sharp with determination. Our instructor was a woman in her 40s named Rachel who had clay permanently embedded under her fingernails and an infectious enthusiasm for what she called the meditation of mud. I liked her immediately, which surprised me. I'd expected to feel out of place, too old, too inexperienced, and too recently divorced to be starting something new. Instead, I felt curious. When was the last time I'd felt curious about anything? Rachel had us start by just touching the clay, feeling its texture, its weight, and its coolness. Don't try to make anything yet, she said. Just get to know it. Let it tell you what it wants to be. I almost laughed at the new age nonsense of it, but then my hands sank into the clay, and something shifted. The world got quieter. My racing thoughts slowed. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about Robert or Diane or my disappointed children or my uncertain future. I was just there, in that moment, feeling cold clay between my fingers. Is this what peace felt like? This simple presence? How had I forgotten? After class, Frank caught up with me in the parking lot. First time, he asked, and I nodded. Me too, he said. My wife died 2 years ago. Everyone kept telling me I needed a hobby, something to fill the time. Took me this long to actually do it. We stood there in the parking lot, two old people who'd recently had their lives upended, and something passed between us. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. We weren't the only ones starting over. The world was full of people reinventing themselves, and they didn't all look like the Instagram post my granddaughter showed me. Some of them looked like Frank and me. I started going to pottery class every Tuesday, and something strange happened. I started looking forward to it. Not just tolerating it or doing it because I said I would, but actually anticipating it. I'd think about it during the week, planning what I wanted to try next, watching YouTube videos about glazing techniques, and boring my daughter with descriptions of the bowl I was working on. Jessica listened patiently, but I could hear the confusion in her voice. Her mother, the one who'd just gone through a devastating divorce, was excited about bowls. It didn't make sense to her, but it made sense to me in a way I couldn't quite explain. 3 weeks into the class, Rachel pulled me aside. "You have a gift for this," she said, and I actually laughed out loud. "Rachel, I'm 72 years old. If I had a gift for pottery, don't you think I would have discovered it by now?" She shook her head, hands on her hips. "No, I think you would have discovered it whenever you were ready to see it. Age has nothing to do with it. Some of my best students started in their 70s. When you're young, you're too worried about being perfect. When you're older, you just let the clay do what it wants. Let the clay do what it wants." The word stayed with me. How much of my life had I spent trying to force things into shapes they didn't want to be? My marriage, my children's choices, my own desires and dreams. What would happen if I stopped trying to control everything and just let things become what they wanted to become? It was a terrifying thought and an exhilarating one at the same time. The divorce papers came through on a Thursday in October, 6 months after that text message in the grocery store. I signed them in my lawyer's office with a hand that shook slightly, not from grief but from the weight of finality. 50 years, reduced to signatures on legal documents. My lawyer, a kind woman named Patricia who'd guided me through the process with patience and wisdom, handed me my copies. "How are you doing?" she asked, and I realized I didn't know how to answer. Was I sad? Yes. Relieved? Also yes. Terrified? Absolutely. But underneath all of that was something else. Something that felt suspiciously like excitement. Was I allowed to be excited about being divorced? Was that awful? I don't know, I told Patricia honestly. Ask me in a year. She smiled. I've been doing this for 20 years, Margaret. I can usually tell which of my clients will be okay. You're going to be more than okay. You're going to be extraordinary. I didn't believe her then. How could I? I was a 72-year-old newly divorced woman living alone in a house that felt too big and too quiet. Extraordinary seemed like an impossible stretch. But her words planted a seed, and seeds have a way of growing when you're not looking. I decided to sell the house. It was too much space for one person, too many memories lurking in every corner, too much yard work and maintenance, and emptiness. My children were horrified. That's our childhood home, Michael protested when I told them. All our memories are there. I looked at my son, my practical, protective son, and I said something that surprised both of us. Your memories are in your heart, Michael, not in a building. And I need to make new memories somewhere that doesn't feel haunted by old ones. The house sold quickly, and I found a small condo in a complex near the community center. 2 bedrooms, a balcony overlooking a garden, underground parking, and best of all, no yard work. My children helped me move, and I could see them trying to hide their sadness as we packed up their childhood. Jessica cried when we took down the pencil marks on the doorframe where we'd measured their heights every year. Michael got quiet when we emptied the garage where Robert had taught him to change a tire. But I felt lighter with every box we packed. Every item I donated or sold was weight I no longer had to carry. Moving day was chaos and catharsis combined. As we carried the last box into my new place, Jessica stood in the middle of my empty living room and said, "It's so small, Mom." She didn't mean it as an insult. I knew that, but I heard the subtext anyway. Small meant I was diminished. Small meant I'd lost something. Small meant my life was shrinking. "It's not small," I said. "It's exactly the right size for me." And I meant it. I didn't need 4 bedrooms and a dining room that sat 12. I needed space to breathe and figure out who I was going to be next. That first night alone in my new condo, I stood on my balcony and looked out at the garden below. Someone had planted rosemary and lavender, and the evening breeze carried their scent up to me. In the distance, I could hear the sounds of the city, people living their lives, going about their business, completely unaware that Margaret Chun was standing on her balcony having an existential crisis. Except it wasn't a crisis anymore. It was more like a cautious hope. I pulled out my phone and did something I've been thinking about for weeks. I texted Frank from pottery class. "Coffee sometime." 3 minutes later, he replied, "Tomorrow. Morrison's. 10 a.m. I need to be clear about something. Frank wasn't a replacement for Robert. I wasn't looking for another husband or even necessarily a romantic relationship. What I was looking for was connection. Real connection. The kind where 2 people see each other clearly and choose to spend time together anyway. Frank and I met for coffee, and we talked for 3 hours. He told me about his wife Eleanor, how they'd been married for 58 years, and how he'd been lost without her until he realized he wasn't lost. He was just alone, and those were different things. I told him about Robert and Diane and the text message that had changed everything. We compared notes on what it felt like to start over when you were supposed to be winding down. "Here's what nobody tells you," Frank said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Getting old isn't the hard part. Getting old while trying to stay who you always were. That's hard. The trick is figuring out that you're allowed to become someone new. That it's never too late to surprise yourself." I thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed. Was I becoming someone new? Or was I becoming who I'd always been underneath all the roles I'd played? Maybe there wasn't a difference. Maybe the self was always evolving, always changing, and the tragedy was when we pretended otherwise. Frank and I fell into an easy friendship. We met for coffee weekly, went to art galleries together, and took a day trip to the coast, where we walked on the beach and talked about everything and nothing. People assumed we were a couple, and sometimes I wondered if we were heading that direction. But then I'd realize I didn't actually care about defining it. We were Frank and Margaret, 2 old people who'd been through hell and come out the other side determined to squeeze every drop of joy out of whatever time we had left. If that turned into romance eventually, fine. If it stayed friendship, also fine. The not knowing didn't scare me anymore. When had that happened? When had uncertainty stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like a possibility? My pottery improved dramatically. Rachel wasn't exaggerating when she said I had a gift for it. Or maybe the gift was just that I wasn't afraid to fail anymore. I made terrible bowls and wonky vases and lopsided mugs, and I didn't care because each failure taught me something. I started experimenting with shapes and glazes, staying after class to practice, and watching hours of tutorials online. My condo started filling up with pottery, and instead of feeling cluttered, it felt alive. It were things I'd made with my own hands, proof that I could create something beautiful, even at 72, even after everything I'd lost. 6 months after the divorce was final, I did something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. I signed up for a pottery retreat in New Mexico, a full week of intensive classes with master potters, living in Adobe casitas, making art from sunrise to sunset. It cost more money than I'd ever spent on myself at once. It required flying alone to a state I'd never visited. It meant being away from my children and grandchildren for a week. And I did it anyway, because the Margaret who would have said no to all of that was gone. Or maybe not gone, but quieter. She still whispered doubts and fears and what-ifs, but I'd learned to acknowledge her and do it anyway. New Mexico was transformative. Not in some mystical, find yourself on a mountaintop way, but in quiet, practical ways. I was competent. I navigated airports and rental cars and unfamiliar roads. I made friends with other potters, including a woman named Susan who was 76 and on her third career. First I was a teacher, she told me over dinner one night. Then I was a mother and grandmother. Now I'm an artist. Who knows what I'll be next? That's the beautiful thing about life. It keeps offering you chances to begin again. I thought about that phrase. Begin again, not start over, with its implication of erasing what came before. But begin again, carrying your history with you while still moving forward. On the last night of the retreat, our instructor had us do something called a raku firing. It's a Japanese technique where you pull pottery out of the kiln while it's still glowing hot and put in containers filled with combustible materials. The fire and smoke create unpredictable patterns and colors. You have no control over the outcome. You just have to trust the process and see what emerges. I watched my pieces come out of the kiln, glowing orange in the darkness, and felt something shift in my chest. This was the metaphor I'd been looking for. Life was a raku firing. You could plan and prepare and work hard, but ultimately, you had to trust the process and see what emerged from the flames. My pieces turned out beautiful. Copper and gold and deep blues swirled together in patterns I never could have planned. They were nothing like what I'd imagined and everything I didn't know I needed. I wrapped them carefully to bring home these tangible reminders that destruction and creation were part of the same process. That you could put something into the fire and have it come out more beautiful than before. I came home from New Mexico different. My children noticed immediately. "Mom, you're glowing," Jessica said when I video called her from the airport. What happened? How could I explain that nothing happened and everything happened? That I'd spent a week making pottery and accidentally found myself? That sounded too much like a midlife crisis, except I was decades past midlife. A late-life crisis. An end-of-life renaissance. There should be a word for what happens when you stop waiting for your life to begin and realize it's been happening all along. You just weren't paying attention. I started teaching a pottery class for beginners at the community center. Rachel had suggested it, and my first instinct had been to say no. What did I have to teach anyone? I was still learning myself. But Rachel pointed out that was exactly why I should teach. The best teachers are the ones still figuring it out, she said. You remember what it's like to be scared and uncertain. You can meet people where they are. So I said yes, and on the first night of class, 6 nervous adults showed up, ranging in age from 30 to 82. They looked at me with hope and fear in their eyes, and I recognized that look because I'd seen it in the mirror not so long ago. Here's what I'm going to tell you, I said to my first class. You're going to be bad at this at first. You're going to make things that look like they were made by a drunk toddler. Your hands are going to hurt, and you'll get clay everywhere, and you'll wonder why you signed up for this. But if you stick with it, something magical happens. Not that you become amazing at pottery, though you might. The magic is that you learn to be okay with not being amazing. You learn to enjoy the process instead of fixating on the product. And that lesson, that ability to be present and imperfect and still joyful, that's worth more than any perfect bowl. Teaching became one of my favorite things. Watching people surprise themselves, seeing them create something they didn't know they could, and being part of their journey of discovery. One of my students was a woman named Carol who'd recently retired and didn't know what to do with herself. She reminded me so much of who I'd been a year ago that it was almost painful. After class one night, she lingered, helping me clean up, and finally said, "How do you do it? How do you make it look so easy?" I laughed. "Carol, nothing about this is easy. But easy isn't the point. The point is showing up anyway." A year after the divorce, Robert reached out. Not with a text this time, but with an actual phone call. I stared at his name on my screen for 3 rings before I answered. "Hello, Robert," I said, and my voice was steady. We made small talk for a minute about the weather and the grandkids, and then he said, "I wondered if you'd like to meet for coffee. There are some things I'd like to say." Part of me wanted to say no. We'd said everything that needed saying in that coffee shop a year ago, hadn't we? But curiosity won out. I agreed to meet him the following week, same coffee shop, different versions of ourselves. He looked good. That was my first thought when I saw him walk into Morrison's. He'd lost weight and looked healthier somehow. Happy. Diane was good for him, I realized with a mixture of bitterness and relief. He sat down across from me, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. This man I'd known for 50 years was now essentially a stranger. You look different, he said finally. Good different. Happy. I didn't know how to respond to that. Was I happy? The question would have paralyzed me a year ago. Now I realized the answer was yes. Complicated, yes. Messy, yes. But yes. I wanted to apologize, Roberts said. Properly. Not just for the text message, though that was cowardly and cruel, but for all the years before that. For checking out of our marriage gradually instead of fighting for it. For not being brave enough to tell you I was unhappy until it was too late to fix it. For letting us both waste years living half-lives. I stirred my coffee, watching the cream swirl. I'm sorry too, I said. For the same reasons. For not noticing you were drowning. For being so comfortable with comfortable that I didn't see we were dying inside. We sat with that for a moment, the weight of mutual culpability. Are you happy? I asked him. With Diane. He nodded slowly. I am. It's not perfect. Nothing is. But we talk. Really talk. About real things. About who we are and what we want and what scares us. I didn't realize how much I'd missed that until I had it again. I should have felt jealous or angry, but I didn't. I felt something closer to gratitude. Gratitude that he'd had the courage to leave, even in the worst possible way, because it forced me to rebuild a life I didn't know I needed. I'm seeing someone, I heard myself say. Frank. He's a widower. We met at pottery class. Robert's eyebrows went up. Pottery class. I laughed. I know. Who knew, right? Turns out I'm good at it. I'm teaching now, actually. We talked for another hour, and it was strange how easy it was. We weren't Robert and Margaret anymore. Not the Robert and Margaret who'd been married for 50 years. We were just two people who'd known each other once, who'd hurt each other and been hurt, who'd somehow made it through to the other side. As we were leaving, Robert paused at the door. I'm glad you're okay, Margaret. More than okay. I'm glad you found yourself. I thought about correcting him, telling him I hadn't found myself. I'd created myself, built myself piece by piece like pottery on a wheel. But maybe he was right. Maybe I'd been there all along, buried under years of should and have to and must, just waiting for someone to dig me out. Even if that someone had to be me. The 1-year anniversary of the text message arrived on a Tuesday. I woke up that morning expecting to feel something dramatic. Grief maybe, or anger, or nostalgia. Instead, I felt curious about what I was going to make in pottery class that evening. I've been working on a series of vases inspired by the desert landscape of New Mexico. I was excited to try a new glazing technique. The fact that my marriage ending warranted less emotional energy than pottery would have horrified the old Margaret. The new Margaret found it perfect. I decided to host a small gathering that weekend. Not a divorce party, though Jessica joked about getting me a cake that said, "Congratulations on your freedom," before I shut that down. Just a casual dinner with the people who'd become important in this new chapter. Frank, of course. Rachel from the community center. Susan, who I'd stayed in touch with after New Mexico. A few of my pottery students. My children and their families. A carefully curated mix of old life and new. Preparing for the party, I realized my condo had become a home. My pottery filled shelves and windowsills. Photos of my grandchildren shared space with pictures from my trip to New Mexico. Frank's reading glasses sat on my coffee table next to a book he'd lent me. The space was small, but it was mine, filled with things I'd chosen, reflecting a life I was actively creating rather than passively enduring. When had this happened? When had I stopped grieving what I'd lost and started celebrating what I'd found? The night of the gathering, I stood in my kitchen making appetizers and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Contentment. Not happiness, which is too fleeting and dependent on circumstances. But contentment. A deep satisfaction with who I was and where I was and what I was building. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Running late. Traffic is terrible. Save me some wine. I smiled and texted back a heart emoji, something the old Margaret would have agonized over. Is that too casual? Should I use proper punctuation? What message does an emoji send? The new Margaret just sent a heart and went back to her cheese plate. People started arriving, and my small condo filled with noise and laughter and life. Frank brought flowers, which he presented with mock formality that made me laugh. Rachel brought a bottle of wine and stories about her latest pottery project. Susan video called from New Mexico, and we propped up my tablet so she could join virtually. My grandchildren played on the balcony while the adults gathered in the living room, and for a moment, I just stood there taking it in. This was community. This was a connection. This was what I'd been missing in those last years of my marriage, when Robert and I had been together but fundamentally alone. After dinner, as people were lingering over coffee and dessert, my grandson Tommy asked me a question that stopped the conversation. "Grandma, are you sad that Grandpa doesn't live here anymore?" The adults tensed, waiting to see how I'd handle this. I looked at Tommy, the sweet 9-year-old trying to understand his world that had shifted. Sometimes, I told him honestly, I'm sad about some things, but I'm also happy about other things. People are complicated like that. We can be sad and happy at the same time. He thought about that, his face serious. "Mom says you're brave," he said, "because you're starting over." I glanced at Jessica, who looked embarrassed but nodded. "I don't know about brave," I said, "but I'm trying. And you know what I've learned? It's never too late to try something new, even when you're old like me." Tommy giggled. "You're not that old, Grandma." I ruffled his hair. "Old enough to know that age is just a number, kiddo. What matters is whether you're living or just existing." After everyone left, after I cleaned up and put away leftovers and stood on my balcony watching the city lights, I pulled out my phone. I scrolled back through my messages to that day a year ago. The text from Robert that had ended 50 years of marriage. "I can't do this anymore. Sorry." I read it again, and for the first time, I didn't feel the sharp stab of pain. I felt something closer to gratitude. Not for the way he'd done it, that would always be cowardly and cruel, but for what it had forced me to do. To examine my life. To ask hard questions. To discover I was capable of more than I'd known. I typed a response, knowing he'd never see it, that this message was really for me. "Thank you," I wrote, "for having the courage to end something that wasn't working, even though you did it badly. For forcing me to rebuild. For showing me I was stronger than I thought. I forgive you. More importantly, I forgive myself. I didn't send it. I didn't need to. The act of writing it was enough." The next morning, I woke up early and went to the community center before my regular pottery class. I wanted to work on a piece I'd been planning for weeks. A large bowl, bigger than anything I'd attempted before, with a complex pattern etched into the clay. It would take hours, maybe days. It might collapse. It might crack in the kiln. It might turn out nothing like I imagined. But I was going to try anyway, because that's what the new Margaret did. She tried things that might fail. She took risks. She created beauty even when the outcome was uncertain. As I worked the clay, feeling it respond to my hands, I thought about the past year. All the things I'd lost and all the things I'd gained. The ending of a marriage and the beginning of a self. The grief and the growth. The fear and the courage. And I realized something profound. I'd spent 50 years being Robert's wife, my children's mother, and my parents' daughter. Those weren't bad things. They'd been important parts of my journey, but they weren't the whole story. I was also Margaret the artist, Margaret the teacher, Margaret the friend, Margaret, the woman who was still becoming, still evolving, still surprising herself. Would I have chosen this path if Robert hadn't sent that text? Probably not. I would have stayed in that comfortable, quiet marriage until one of us died, telling myself it was fine. This was just what long marriages looked like. I would have missed this entire chapter of my life, this discovery that I was capable of reinvention at 72. So maybe the text message wasn't an ending after all. Maybe it was an invitation. A brutal, badly delivered, deeply painful invitation, but an invitation nonetheless. An invitation to step into a fuller version of myself. The bowl I was working on started to take shape under my hands. It was lopsided and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. Kind of like life, I thought. Kind of like me. I'd never be perfect. I'd never have all the answers. I'd probably keep making mistakes and having doubts and wondering if I was doing any of this right. But I was doing it. I was showing up. I was creating something instead of just consuming or maintaining. And that felt like enough. Frank came by later that afternoon to pick me up for a gallery opening. He found me in the pottery studio, hands covered in clay, completely absorbed in my work. "You look happy," he said, and it wasn't a question. I looked up at him, this kind man who'd become such an important part of my new life, and I smiled. "I am," I said. "I really am." And the truth of it hit me fully for the first time. I was happy, not in spite of everything that had happened, but maybe because of it. Because sometimes you have to break apart completely before you can rebuild yourself into something stronger. We went to the gallery, and I found myself drawn to a series of photographs showing doors. Old doors, new doors, open doors, closed doors. Each one representing a choice, a possibility, a path taken or not taken. I thought about the doors in my own life. The ones I'd walked through and the ones I'd closed. The one Robert had shut when he sent that text. The ones I'd opened since then, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. Life was just a series of doors, I realized. The trick was having the courage to walk through them, even when you couldn't see what was on the other side. On the drive home, Frank was quiet, and I knew he was working up to saying something. Finally, he pulled over at a scenic overlook and turned to me. "I need to tell you something," he said, and my heart dropped. Here it comes, I thought. The other shoe dropping. The thing that's too good to be true is revealing itself as exactly that. But instead, he said, "I'm falling in love with you, Margaret. And I need you to know I don't expect anything. We can keep things exactly as they are if that's what you want. But I needed to be honest." I looked at this man, this unexpected gift who'd appeared in my life at exactly the right moment, and I realized something. I was falling in love with him too. Not the desperate, consuming love of youth. Not the comfortable, habitual love of a long marriage. Something different. Something that felt like a choice rather than a need. "I'm falling in love with you too," I said. "And I have no idea what that means or where this is going. And for the first time in my life, I'm okay with not knowing." We sat there in his car overlooking the city, two old people who'd lived entire lives before meeting each other. And we laughed. At the absurdity of finding love at our age. At the fact that it had taken loss and grief and divorce and death to get us here. At the realization that life kept offering plot twists no matter how old you got. "What do we do now?" Frank asked. I thought about it. "We keep showing up," I said. "We keep trying. We keep being honest. We keep surprising ourselves. And we see what happens." 3 months later, I had my first art show. Well, not a real gallery show, but Rachel arranged for a local cafe to display some of my pottery. The opening night was small, just friends and family and regular cafe customers who happened to be there. But standing in that cafe, looking at 15 pieces of my work displayed on shelves and tables, I felt something I'd never felt before. Pride. Not pride in accomplishment, though I was proud of the work, but pride in becoming. Pride in the woman who'd been shattered by a text message and had picked up the pieces and made something new. My children came to the opening, and I watched them look at my work with something like wonder. "Mom, these are really good," Michael said, and he sounded surprised. I didn't take offense. I was surprised too. "When did you get so talented?" Jessica asked. "I've been talented all along," I said. "I just didn't know it because I never tried." That statement hung in the air between us, and I saw them processing it. All the things their mother might have been if she'd tried. All the versions of Margaret that had existed but had never been explored. It was a gift, I realized, not just to me but to them. A reminder that people contain multitudes, that it's never too late, that reinvention is always possible. One of my pieces sold that night. A bowl with copper and gold glazing, imperfect and beautiful. A woman bought it as a gift for her mother, who was going through a divorce. "She needs to know she can create something beautiful from the broken pieces," the woman said when she paid. I almost told her the story of how that bowl represented my own journey, how it had come out of the fire transformed. But I decided the bowl could tell its own story. That was the magic of art. I was learning. You put your truth into it, but once it left your hands, it became whatever truth the viewer needed. That night, lying in bed in my small condo with Frank asleep beside me, I thought about the question that had haunted me a year ago. Who was I if I wasn't Robert's wife? I had my answer now. I was Margaret. Just Margaret. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. I pulled out my phone one last time and opened my voice memos. I'd started recording thoughts and observations over the past year, a kind of audio journal. I pressed record and spoke quietly into the darkness. Note to self, I said, a year ago, you thought your life was ending. You were wrong. It was beginning. Remember that the next time you're afraid. Remember that you're stronger than you think. Remember that it's never too late to become who you were always meant to be. Remember that text messages can't define you unless you let them. Remember that 50 years of one story just means you get to write a new story now. Remember that you're doing it. You're actually doing it. And that's everything. I saved the recording and put my phone down. Tomorrow I'd teach a pottery class. Next week, Frank and I are taking a road trip to visit Susan in New Mexico. Next month, I am starting a second class for advanced students. Next year, who knew? That was the beautiful part. I didn't have to know. I just had to keep showing up, keep trying, and keep becoming. The rest would figure itself out. So here's what I want you to know. If you're reading this, if you're watching this, if you're listening to this story and seeing yourself in it, here's what I need you to understand. It's never too late. Whatever age you are, whatever situation you're in, whatever endings you're facing, it's never too late to begin again. Not start over, begin again. Taking everything you've learned, everything you've survived, everything you are, and building something new with it. Maybe your marriage ended with a text message too. Maybe you're facing retirement and don't know who you are without your job. Maybe you're 72 or 52 or 32 and feeling like it's too late to change direction. I'm here to tell you it's not. You are not your past. You are not your mistakes. You're not your age. You're a possibility. You're a potential. You're becoming. And that's the most exciting thing in the world. I'm asking you to do something for me right now. Stop this video and write down one thing you've always wanted to try but haven't because you thought you were too old, too late, too scared, or too something. Just one thing. Write it down. Now I'm asking you to take one small step toward that thing this week. Not tomorrow, not someday, but this week. One small step. Sign up for a class. Buy the supplies. Make the phone call. Tell someone your dream. Just one small step. That's all it takes to begin. And then I want you to come back here and tell me what you did. Leave a comment. Share your story. Let's build a community of people who are done waiting for permission to live fully. Who are done letting age or circumstance or fear dictate their possibilities. Who are ready to surprise themselves with what they're capable of. Because here's the secret they don't tell you. The best years of your life might still be ahead of you, but only if you have the courage to reach for them. 50 years of my marriage ended with one text message. But my life, my real life, the one where I finally became fully myself, that life began with the same text message. Endings and beginnings are just different ways of looking at the same moment. The question is, which one are you going to choose to see? So tell me, what's your one thing? What's the dream you've been putting off? What's the version of yourself you've been too scared to become? Share it in the comments below. Make it real by saying it out loud. And then take that first small step. I promise you, the view from the other side is worth it. I'm living proof. We all are. Every single person who's had the courage to begin again. Your story isn't over. It's just beginning. So what are you waiting for?